thanks. That's probably my time off, actually, isn't it? Now, I know you've been all having to listen to lots of presentations, so I want to cut short some of what I'm saying, give you a chance to speak. I think we've been talking really about two sorts of food poverty today, and with the contributions which have been great from colleagues. One is the kind of food poverty that leads to the food bank phenomenon, if I can put it that way, that's to do with a lack of money to be able to buy food and to feed yourself and your family for whatever reason. I want to say a little bit about that. And the other's a different kind of food poverty. It's not knowing much about food, it's not knowing what's in food, it's not knowing what's good for you, it's not knowing how to cook. It's all of the kinds of things that both Miles and Phil have been talking about some of the solutions to, and that's a different kind of food poverty. Now, it seems to me that we're dealing with both of those, and you have to bear in mind, I'm going to say something about the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in a minute. You've got to bear in mind I've been in this job for 4 weeks. I can tell you a lot about transport, by the way, but I'm going to resist the temptation. I was in that job for 3 years. But I want to just say a little bit about what we've all recognised, which is this burgeoning use of food banks that we've seen over the past period of time. And this didn't start under this government. There were food banks that had opened under the Labour government, and that has to be accepted and admitted. And there were 4,000 people a year that by the end of the Labour government had gone up to 41,000 people a year who were visiting food banks up to 2010. That is a tenfold increase, but it's an increase from 4,000 to 41,000. 41,000 too many, but nonetheless, obviously the numbers were on the up. This year, according to the Trussell Trust, and I know many of you are volunteers for food banks, some of which are Trussell Trust food banks. This year, Chris Mould, who's the executive chairman of the Trussell Trust, put out some figures last month on the 16th of October that said that over 350,000 people received emergency food aid from the Trussell Trust between April and September of this year. That is triple the numbers helped in the same period last year. And Chris Mould's response to that was to say, and I'm going to quote him now because it's important that it's not me that's saying this is what he says. We said in April that the increasing numbers of people turning to food banks should be a wake-up call to the nation, but there has been no policy response and the situation is getting worse. The level of food poverty in the UK is not acceptable. It's scandalous and it's causing deep distress to thousands of the people. The time has come for an official and in-depth inquiry into the causes of food poverty and the consequent rise in the usage of food banks. As a nation, we need to accept that something is wrong and that we need to act now to stop UK hunger getting worse. Now, I agree with Chris Mould about that, and I agree that there is something going on that we've not got fully to the bottom of. I agree that it's a scandal and that something needs to be done about it, but there has been no response from the government to that call from Chris Mould for a national inquiry. In fact, what we've heard from Michael Gove in response to what Luciana said to him was that his quote is this, that visits to food banks are often the result of decisions that have been taken by people which mean they're not best able to manage their finances. That's one government response. Lord Freud, who's a DWP minister in the government, said that he said this, the supply is a free good, and by definition there's almost an infinite demand for a free good, suggesting that people are going to food banks because the food is free and are just taking it because it's free. From DEFRA, from Owen Paterson, which is actually technically the department that's in charge of food in the government, we've had zero kind of response, nothing, no policy response. Now, I am new in this department, shadowing this department, but I think it's wrong that DEFRA has not responded properly, or in any way really, to what is going on with the huge increase that we're seeing in the use of food banks. The Trussell Trust are setting up 2 to 3 food banks a week, and they're doing that not because they're trying to empire build, expand for the sake of expansion, but because they're trying to meet a need that they feel is there and that is a demand that is there out in various communities, and not just what are traditionally thought of as the deprived communities, but in a much wider range of places where you would not think that there was a level of deprivation that we're used to seeing, for example, in some parts of Liverpool. And it's not just Chris Mould and the Trussell Trust who are saying that there's a serious issue for our nation about this. The British Red Cross, as Luciana said earlier, has announced that it's collecting food in order to distribute in this country for the first time since World War II to meet what it perceives as a need. It's concerned by the levels of UK hunger. Now, we are the 7th richest nation in the world. And it is a matter, I think, for serious concern, at the very least, that we can find ourselves in this situation. It is certainly a requirement of any government, I think, that seeks to uphold the well-being of our nation and of the people of this nation, that they would be concerned about this and want to do something about it and want to find out what is going on. Why is this happening? Now, we don't know fully. We don't know fully. There is a complex picture. It isn't just about one matter. But we do know, for example, because the Trussell Trust collect the figures, that 19% of people are referred to food bank due to benefit changes. In other words, they've had their benefits stopped and they suddenly don't have any money to buy food. 35% due to benefit delay. In other words, they've applied for a benefit to which they're entitled and the decision has not been made about whether or not they are going to receive that money, and therefore the money isn't in payment. Both of those numbers are up by a number of percentage points each on last year. And whilst the number of food banks over the last year has doubled, treble the number of people are actually making use of those food banks and receiving emergency food. So we do know that it's not just that the number of food banks has gone up, and that's why the number of people in the Lord Freud kind of analysis, that's why the number of people have gone up, because the number of people using those increasing number of food banks is going up faster than the increase in the food banks. So we do know that people's current situation and policies of the government, or the indifference of the government, however you choose to see it from whichever political perspective you come, are making it worse. Austerity is bound to make this kind of thing worse because there's less money around, and therefore there's a cost of living crisis caused in part by the consequences of austerity that are contributing to this. We know, and these are facts, that people are £1,600 a year worse off, on average, over the last 3 years. That is the worst slump in living standards, in real living standards in this country, that this country has suffered since 1870. We're having and seeing the slowest recovery. There is a recovery, thank goodness, but it's the slowest recovery from a recession that we've had for over 100 years. We know that prices are going up faster than stagnating or falling wages for those who are in work. We know that many people who are working part-time want full-time work and are not able to get it. We know that many people who want to work are not in employment and are therefore dependent upon benefits, which are being cut, and sometimes they're having extra payments like a bit of council tax they've suddenly got to pay, having never had to pay it. They may be affected by the bedroom tax. I have over 3,000 families in my constituency alone affected by the bedroom tax, and I have had many people come to see me literally in tears who just do not have the money. That is not about being unable to budget. It's about not having enough money in the budget. And at the same time, we all see it, prices going up faster than wages. And for 40 of the 41 months since our current Prime Minister's been in his job in Downing Street, prices have risen faster than wages. That is what's causing the squeeze in people's living standards that is leading, in part, to some of this problem. And food costs have been going up too. Inflation in food is higher than it is in some other things, which means that food is rushing out of the budget of some people. And of course it's worse for those who aren't working than for those who are, and their incomes are being squeezed in many ways even worse. So this is part of the answer to why we're seeing this big increase in the use of food banks and dependence on food banks. But there's another issue that concerns me. Just coming into this job, and as I say, I've been doing it for 4 weeks, and I could talk a lot more perhaps about transport than I can about with knowledge about this at this stage. But there's also an issue, I believe, about nutritional standards, authenticity. All of these things are the responsibility of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Cheaper food is often less nutritionally worthwhile. It's often less healthy in the longer run. It's processed, perhaps. It's full of fat. It's full of sugar, overloaded with salt. The kind of things that might be all right for a 3-day emergency, but if you're on a diet like that for years and years, can have real health consequences. And much of what people are eating is less nutritious, and we know, because there's been some evidence of this, that as austerity has bitten, as the cost of living crisis has increased, people have been trading down in their food choices. Even when they can afford food, they've been buying cheaper value goods. I think there is an issue for government in this respect. We must demand the highest standards of nutritional input in respect of our food. And I'm not convinced, I'm new at this, so this is not a definitive statement. I'm not convinced that our nutritional standards are high enough, or that the regulation that we have in this area is appropriately either policed, enforced, or even set at the right level. I do know that as the National Audit Office were producing a report that said that the horse meat scandal had been caused in part, or not helped, by a split since 2010 in the responsibilities for food policy in England, which had led to a confusion between stakeholders about who was responsible for checking controls. We know that whilst that was going on, government ministers were in Europe arguing nutritional standards are unnecessary red tape that should be dropped. And I do think we do have to reconsider. I think this government would do well to reconsider some of its attitudes about regulation when it comes to our food. Because the horse meat scandal, if it has shown anything, has shown that there's a problem. That it's shown that that we're not as good as we were at being able to see and check and be sure about the authenticity of our food. Now, obviously, we don't like to eat horse meat if it's labelled as beef. You know, there are some people who perhaps wouldn't mind eating horse meat as long as they knew what they were eating. There are some people who would mind, and who certainly wouldn't want to be eating it without knowing about it. We know, for example, that reported food fraud is up by 2/3 over the last 3 years, but the number of local authority tests on our food, and it's largely local authorities that do the testing to try and check for these problems, has been cut by 1/4 because, of course, what's happened to our local authority budget in Liverpool, half of all Liverpool's money will have been taken away by 2015-16. What's the first thing that goes? Unnecessary things like testing for the authenticity of food, or things that are lower down the list of must-dos, because one has statutory obligations. Must-dos at the top of the list, and those that would be desirable but will have to make do without lower down, like food authenticity tests, are what disappears. So the horse meat scandal was only identified because the Irish Food Safety Agency did some tests and discovered that there was horse meat in what had been labelled as beef. As I visited one of my own food banks in my constituency just a couple of weeks ago, it was on the same day that the Food Standards Association, the Food Standards Organisation, Food Standards Agency had just revealed yet another finding of horse meat in cheap value meat, tinned meat products. Now, this is what people are starting to resort to in order to make ends meet. There is a real issue here for policymakers, and it isn't just about authenticity and not wanting people to end up eating horse when they think they're eating beef. Some of those horses were contaminated with bute, with an animal drug which is not fit for human consumption. That scandal could have been a human health scandal. We all remember mad cow disease. That resulted in people dying. That resulted in people dying. And it could happen again if we're not careful about these kinds of things. And of course it's in the cheaper processed food that you tend to get adulteration. So I do think there's an issue here for policymakers and for the department. And of course, mad cow disease, salmonella in eggs, wasn't only a disaster for human health and for people getting ill, it destroyed large swathes of our food industry, which actually is a big industry in this country, employing many hundreds of thousands of people. And if our confidence in that industry is impaired in this kind of way, then it can have a big consequence for our economy and for the growth of our economy, for employment, as well as for anything that it may mean to human health. So what should we be doing about this kind of thing? Well, DEFRA, the department that I now shadow, it's the 7th department that I've either actually been in as a minister or shadowed as a shadow cabinet member over the last 12 years. And so I like to think I've started to understand a little bit about Whitehall. And my impression of it, having spoken to some senior stakeholders and had a good look at it over the last 4 weeks, it's less than a month I know, but my impressions from that experience is that it's quite an impaired organisation. It's lost a lot of its staff. It took, in 2010, some of the biggest cuts to Whitehall departments of any Whitehall department. Caroline Spellman, then the Secretary of State, offered up, or had imposed on her, whichever way around it is. It took a big hit. It doesn't have a great reputation for competence. It appears to be suffering from low morale, perhaps not surprisingly, amongst some of the remaining staff. And like many departments of state at the moment, it's finding it harder to deliver the promised action that it's undertaken to deliver on time. So, for example, the report that was due this summer about why this big increase in food banks has not appeared, and we have not had any explanation as to why not, and we'll keep chasing on that. But we haven't had any explanations as to why not. So I think it's a department that is under pressure and that isn't necessarily firing on all cylinders in the way in which we would hope that it might. Now that obviously has an implication for how well it can deliver what it seeks to do and what its political leaders, in this case Owen Paterson, seek to get it to do. They seem to be rather focused on badgers at the moment, but there's no doubt about the fact that these important food safety, food authenticity and food issues should be a large part of what the department is doing. And I haven't seen a lot of indication so far in the 4 weeks that I've been shadowing it that it is the kind of level of priority that I would like to see if things were, if I had my way, as it were. So I think we have to develop an ask. I mean, what I will do as a shadow cabinet minister for this department is look to identify what I think the priorities for the department ought to be within its shrunken budget. And it may well be that my priorities will be different from those of the current Secretary of State. I can't give you a full list yet because it's too soon since I took over, but what I can say is that food poverty, food authenticity, food labelling have got to be a central part of what the department is focusing itself on. And I will be working with colleagues across the shadow cabinet. Luciana in the health team, of course, because she's doing public health. A big part of eating properly and food is about public health, but also other departments. And I think we need to focus on both kinds of food poverty, not only getting to the bottom of why we've seen this huge increase in food banks and what we should do about it, because they're not should not be a permanent part of our landscape, and it should not be something that we aspire to see growing in the exponential way in which they are. But also the other kind of food poverty that I've been discussing, which is this lack of understanding of our food, lack of understanding of what's in it, what's good for you, what isn't good for you, how to cook it. And I think organisations like CanCook and organisations like those that Phil represents here today that are community organisations based in our communities that have solutions that work locally, that they've worked up, have got to be a large part of us getting that right, as well as perhaps some of the more national proposals which Miles has been talking about in respect of school food. All have a part to play, but one thing is for sure, if we don't get people properly fed, then we're not going to have a healthy society or healthy people going into the next generation. Thank you.